The following podcast may include coarse language, graphic content, and politically and/or religiously sensitive material. Those of you who are offended by such content should fuck off.
Welcome to the Daemoneye podcast, episode 11, that's 11 in German. The podcast where we discuss tabletop gaming and electronic gaming, science fiction and fantasy materials, actual science and technology, geek culture, and why Anubis, the Egyptian god of the dead, is eating peanut butter toast in my garage. Today's topic is mythology and its influence in gaming. Hi, I'm Jay Burrell, author of the company's gaming materials and dork lord of the Crunchy GIF.
My name is Tristan Eifler, the business side of the company, and the far prettier one. Shut up!
That's just what we tell him so he doesn't cry himself to sleep at night.
You told me you would never speak of that. Hey, how's it going, everyone? As you can see, Tyler has taken over the intros this episode. We should do it more often.
Pity you all.
Okay, and as he said, the topic for this episode is mythology and gaming. We always encounter orcs and goblins and slaughter them wantonly and take their stuff, but you might wonder, where do all those monsters come from? What are their origins? What do they dream of at night? And we're going to kind of get into that, and more seriously speaking, the role and impact of mythology in gaming, how certain aspects have been co-opted, and so on and so forth. But before we move on to that, let's go ahead and go with the status update. Tyler, how are you doing?
Not half bad, which for me is pretty damn good.
I made this remark early on before we started recording, and for you, that's actually fantastic. Me, I'm doing...
I know, it was so good I decided to steal it.
Yes. As for me, I'm doing so-so, just trying to get back on track and live life a little more than I usually do, other than just coming home from work and staring at the computer all day long and getting some shit done. It's been a little weird lately, that's all I can say. And as far as projects go, I am continuing to work on my writing. I've gotten another chapter nearly done. So those of you who are actually listening to this podcast and read my work, all three of you, another chapter will be coming out in the Old Wounds series. And how about you, Tyler, creative-wise?
Creative-wise, I'm still working on the Varadice system for the app game. Somebody made a comment earlier, I believe it was Edge, when he was testing it out, that it was such a great system that all it needed was a little bit of expansion and it could probably be turned into a complete role-playing game in and of itself with an extremely small rulebook. I was thinking maybe doing that when we get closer to the release of the app game is kind of like a publicity thing.
Yes. For those of you who didn't listen to the last podcast, which is probably most of you, we are working on a video game based off the Shadows Move setting we kind of developed in-house. And we've actually developed a custom rules engine for it. Tyler, I should say, has done it, and he did it a long time ago.
Yeah, it's one of those things that was basically on the back burner on a hard drive. And then the hard drive, as well as the rest of the computer, kind of melted down. And I'm not saying that facetiously. I mean, it actually caught fire and melted.
Tyler, that must have been a hard loss.
Bad pun, man. Bad pun.
I'm a bit of a maestro when it comes to bad puns. You might say I'm punishing you.
Okay, that one was better.
Damn. And how is Dragonfire coming along?
I actually have it on my schedule this week to get some work done on it.
Uh-huh.
I'm hoping to finally have the spell list done by the end of this month.
So we might be seeing the finalized product sometime at the end of summer, possibly?
With any luck. After all, we only need 2 to 4 at most images left.
Ooh.
But the problem is we don't. I know we definitely need 2 more images. It's the remaining 0 to 2 images that I'm unsure of because it requires finishing all of the descriptions for spells and magic items in the relevant chapters to see how much white space needs filling, which I don't know until I finish all the spells and magic items in those relevant chapters. And I'm looking at creating 500 individual freaking entries here.
This is the side of game publication that isn't as glamorous and most people don't realize is a big part of it. For those of you who don't
monotony.
Well, for those of you who don't know, he's referring to the Universal Decay fantasy expansion, Dragonfire. So if you enjoyed killing aliens in Dead Stars, you might enjoy killing dragons in Dragonfire.
Especially when your characters since it's a punk fantasy setting, your characters can be anything from half-naked, tattoo-covered dwarves that get superpowers based purely on the power of their own ego, to gnomes with Tommy guns,
and everything in between. It's quite fun. I've played more than a couple of times, I should say. So, with any luck, we'll be having another major product coming out very soon. Look forward to it. So that's our personal status update and the kind of update on our products. I think we can go on and move on to the main topic of this particular podcast, mythology and gaming. So you were the one who prompted this topic. You brought up this as a possible topic, Tyler. So why don't you go ahead and start us off?
All right. When we're referring to mythology and gaming, most people would default to think of D&D, but what people don't realize is that there were war games prior to, or D&D comes from wargaming, and there were fantasy-based war games prior to Warhammer.
I think the direct descendant of D&D, which of course is the granddaddy of almost all role-playing games, is Chainmail.
Yes. And even then, you have to look at the fantasy elements of those games, which admittedly there weren't very many of them. And it was mostly along the lines of trolls and giants and the occasional dragon and things of that nature. Essentially, it was a Tolkien ripoff.
Well, yes. Also, but to be fair, I'm not sure if this happened before or after Chainmail. They also ripped off Lovecraft.
Oh, it was way after.
Way after, yeah. I think it was in one of the monster manuals, of course. They got sued, as I recall, over that, or got legal action. But anyways, go on.
Oh, there's an entire chain of stupidity related to that. The lawsuit was against TSR way back in the day when they released, I believe it was first edition, and introduced the Illithid, a brain-eating tentacled monster that invades nightmares, yada yada yada. Incredibly Lovecraftian. So Lovecraftian that, if I memory serves correctly, the Lovecraft estate sued the TSR for violation of intellectual, or for basically the Mickey Mouse clause. You ripped off our intellectual property. The problem being that Lovecraft mythos predated Mickey Mouse, and there is a brief window in time where it lapsed out of copyright control and entered public domain. And once something's in public domain, it's in public domain, in perpetuity. That's the whole point of public domain. Well, fast forward a number of decades, and you have the system reference document and the open gaming license, which allows independent game companies such as ours to produce new game books, materials, and whatnot related to the D&D D20 based rolling dice system. And a lot of people decided to make stuff based on an incredibly underutilized or underexpanded monster, the Illithid. And then promptly got sued out of existence unless their name was Mont Cook. I hate that bastard. Sorry, personal preference. The funny thing about it is the lawsuits all cited violation of intellectual property, stating that they owned the Illithid and there was no prior artwork for it. But they previously had used the prior existence of the art that the Illithid is based off of from Lovecraft being in public domain as their defense against the Lovecraft estate, and won that case. But nobody and their dog who's involved in this has enough money to take them to court, because court fees, even if you win, are monstrous when you go up against a big corporation like Wizards of the Coast at the time, and now Hasbro.
Yeah, I thought that kerfuffle was more over the monster mythology and the inclusion of mythos deities in the list of gods like Hastur and so forth.
Actually, Hastur comes from Catholic mythology.
Well,
it was a sideways inclusion into Lovecraftian mythology.
I mean, Lovecraft incorporated a bunch of stuff, but it was specifically resembled a lot of stuff. Like, I mean, Cthulhu, I think, was in there for God's sake.
Oh yeah, Cthulhu was totally was completely ripped off wholesale, and I think if I remember correctly, it was the first edition, the first edition Monstrous Manual. It had a write up for Cthulhu for like the first print run, and then they took it out for the rest of the print runs because this lawsuit ran for like 5 years, and by the time they actually won the lawsuit, they had already done the galleys and everything for the first set of second edition print runs of the Monster Manual, which didn't have any of the Lovecraft deity entries or any deity entries at all in it. And then, but it still had entries for things like the Illithid because they could see which way the court was going. But they didn't bother to put any deities into the second edition Monster Manual, which, in retrospect, was probably a good thing because as soon as you assign numbers to something, you can kill it.
Oh yeah. Well, I think we've digressed far enough here, but there is a bit of a segue. In that, in mythology, this is an example of copyright actually coming to play in mythology. But most of the time, when you incorporate mythology, there's no copyright, there's no ownership. It belongs to everybody in games. So it's small wonder that D&D pulled from a wide variety of mythologies in constructing their pantheons.
Yeah, most of what we consider to be fantasy gaming elements today, orcs, trolls, Medusa, that kind of thing, is kind of a mishmash of 3 separate strains of mythology. You have ancient Greek mythology, you have Catholic and Orthodox mythology. People don't realize it here in the States, but Orthodoxy is a completely separate branch of Christianity than Catholicism.
Example, the Russian Orthodoxy, yeah.
Yeah. And there's also Tolkien-inspired, or the Tolkienized Northern European mythology.
That includes the Celtic traditions, Irish superstitions, some Germanic stuff too, and Norse stuff, yeah, absolutely. All of which, of course, which is from Western tradition, which is what the writers of D&D were most familiar with. Of course, there are a host of other traditions they could have drawn from, and did later draw from Asian mythology, Indian mythology, not much African mythology, although that's a pretty ripe thing to go. It's a little hard to get information on, I suppose. At least it used to be.
I always thought it was hilarious that Tolkien took the idea of the little people under the hill from Celtic mythology and just made them into little people under the hill who loved to eat and smoke weed.
Hence the Hobbit, or Halfling, since D&D was sued over that name, they just renamed it. But in any case, So of course, in mythology and in D&D, there are adaptations made to it to fit the purposes of the wargamers and later the role players. Like, for example, Medusa was actually a singular, a cursed priestess who was cursed by a god, which one, and made to be so ugly that it turned anyone to stone by looking at it. But it later became a race. Same thing for Pegasus, actually. Pegasus was a singular being that coincidentally arose from the corpse of Medusa when it was slain. And they turned that into an entire race of winged horses.
Yeah, they did that a lot. There's the Gorgon, there's the Minotaur of Crete, and there's a lot of singular instances of this is the only creature that exists that was made by the gods, particularly the Greek pantheon, because they were like they were massive dickholes like that. singular creatures that were made by the gods, usually through curses of one sort or another, that they just ended up putting into the D&D world as an entire species of creatures.
Now, fair enough. They did this because they wanted to have monsters which players could slay and also create this kind of backdrop as a world. But you could also argue that kind of made the monsters more banal, more, less impressive because, you killed the Minotaur. Well, there are about a dozen other Minotaurs in this maze.
See my previous comment about numbers and being able to kill things.
Yeah, so I mean, it did kind of take these, good argue, it did kind of bring them down, these legendary creatures. But it also kind of let them expand them, kind of treating them as a separate race. You could also create more background and let them kind of rewrite the myths, reinvent them, which honestly is a human nature and a part of storytelling, a part of mythology, you might say. It changes over time.
Well, anthropologists have shown that the Neanderthals, which we coexisted with for a period of, I think it was about 50,000 years, had larger brain capacities and were capable of language just than us, and basically in comparison to our intellectual capacity at the time, the Neanderthals were like an entire race of freaking Einsteins. So why did we survive where they died out? The reason for that is while they were capable of language, we are capable of sharing and mixing our ideas. We have this compulsion to blab, to, instance, podcasting, to share and tweak and manipulate and put our own spin on things. And while the Neanderthals were a comparative race of geniuses, each individual Neanderthal had to come up with each individual little familial tribe of Neanderthals had to come up with each discovery all over again, whereas for the for the Homo sapiens, we just had to have one person have a bright idea, and then in the span of a generation, we all share in that idea.
I never read any papers or articles to that effect. Sounds a little questionable. I mean, because I know there are other factors. This is my science coming out. In that humans were more adaptable living on the plains. We were also better long-distance runners, which made us better at hunting in some regards. But in any case, I still think
I'm referring to our coexistence with Neanderthals in the European continent, not to our hunter-gatherer origins on the African continent.
Okay, we're digressing again, but I think your main point is taken that humans, creative species, we constantly reinvent and reapply myths, and this is another application of the myths as imaginary things we fight in a game, and we will co-op almost everything. I mean, hell, demons and devils. I mean, that's Catholic Catholicism, and if you get angry at me for saying Catholic Catholicism, you're listening to the wrong podcast here, buddy.
Yeah, even that they stole wholesale from Jewish mythology, and even the Jews stole it wholesale from Baalic mythology, which comes from Mesopotamian mythology. I mean, our modern day concept of demons and devils and oogie boogie things that are trying to swallow your soul, dead by dawn. It goes all the freaking way back to the floodplains of Mesopotamia, where people were trying to explain things like outbreaks of influenza that would wipe out entire villages.
And I think we touched upon this topic before. Beyond simply a role as sacks of meat or ectoplasm to beat up and take shit from, what other role have these mythological creatures kind of taken in fantasy? I say we kind of touched upon this before because I mentioned in the world building aspect, expanding the myth of a singular creature to an entire race.
I think a lot of it, or a lot of how mythology has influenced gaming, comes in the form of, wallpapering. And you have a rule set and a goal that you want to achieve. Think of that rule set and that goal as being everybody sitting around a table in a room. Well, if the room is completely bare, everybody's going to get bored. So you have to put things up. You have to paint pictures on the virtual walls of the room to give them to give people things to interact with, things to do. And rather than try and come up with stuff wholesale, completely out of your ass, well, we're humans. We grab what we know and we mix, or we tweak it a little bit, and we toss it on the wall and see what sticks.
Mm-hmm. So again, world building. So let's think of some monsters which are more or less complete inventions in D&D. We mentioned lithids, which are kind of a complete invention, though they were borrowed heavily from a more recent mythology, the mythos Lovecraft. What other creatures do you think were more or less uniquely or didn't borrow a lot from existing mythologies? Can you think of many?
Well, when people are asked that, they often point out the weird stuff, such as the Beholder and but the Beholder comes from Chinese mythology. It's the eye orb. They even call it the eye orb in one of the descriptions of it. But then there's the what was the other one? The Displacer Beast. But actually, the Displacer Beast comes from, I think it was a 1950s or 1960s novella about a panther-like monster with barbed tentacles coming out of its shoulders that was capable of moving the image of itself from one location to another. Come on, that's the freaking Displacer Beast, completely, totally, a total freaking ripoff.
Well, I mean, is that really a mythology then? Because they're just taking a creature from an existing story that's rather recent. Do you think there exists a boundary between just invented creatures for fiction or mythology, or is that statement entirely nonsensical?
Well, consider this. Given our current level of technology and the level of technology in, say, Star Wars, would you say that the Millennium Falcon is a piece of mythology? Now, before you answer that, roll your mind back in the day a few thousand years to ancient Rome and Hephaestus, the god of the forge, and the mechanical owl that he made for one hero.
Bubo.
I can't remember the name.
Bubo, I think.
Yeah, Bubo.
Yeah.
Well, that mechanical owl, in relation to the technology of the day, was just as far as advanced as Millennium Falcon is from our technology of today. But we can comfortably term that mechanical owl as a piece of mythology. But we can't term modern-day science fiction as mythology?
I think it goes a little deeper than that. It has to have some sort of meaning, some sort of resonance. It has to fit, these archetypes that kind of exist. I am a big.
Oh, come on! The Millennium Falcon is highly archetypical.
Oh, I'm not saying it isn't, Tyler. I'm not arguing that it's not. I agree with you. I'm just saying, I'm a big fan of Carl Gustav Jung. I read a lot of his books. And his idea of archetype. These figures that come into human, that repeatedly appear in human myth. I mean, James, what's his name? Campbell. The hero with a thousand faces.
James Campbell.
Thank you, James Campbell. God, I read his book recently too. He pointed out these figures, these repeating patterns, and I like what Jung said is that they're essentially these patterns that naturally appear in the human mind the same way crystals naturally form a certain lattice based on their
But Jung also believed in the communal subconscious, a kind of dream time that all humans tap into. But really, what we've discovered from modern day neuroscience is that the essential archetypes that Jung was referring to are just a factor of the way our brains are wired together. There isn't everybody has a subconscious telepathic link to everybody else. We just happen to have similar architecture.
Jung did not believe in a telepathic collective unconscious. He more or less what you just said, that it is just the way our brains are wired and these patterns emerge as a result. That's literally what he meant. He did not believe in this collective unconscious as every mind linked telepathically or some mystical way. He liked to use mystical or mythical allegories, but at the end of the day, he was an anthropologist and a scientist, first and foremost. That's a little pet peeve of mine, Tyler.
Yeah, but since he came up and proposed the entire term, the collective unconscious, I'm afraid we're going to have to agree to disagree on this point.
I think it was just an unfortunate phrasing that has been since misinterpreted. I've actually read his works, and it's not, and people did misinterpret it there. Trust me on this. But in any case, the main point is that, which we again diverge from, is that it has to resonate, these myths. It has to have another meaning. It has to fill this archetype of the maiden, the crone, the slayer, the beast. even the minor ones. It has to kind of resonate. I mean, it's hard and easy to find at the same time. So if you just have like, I don't know, a monster in a dime novel that looks like a red owl or something that shoots lasers, that's not really a myth. That's just a creature in a story. But something like, you're going to hate me for using this one, Tyler, but the first one that came to mind, Aslan in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Yes, I know he's an allegory for Christ, but it's still a figure as a savior creature. There we go.
Even as a kid, I hated those books.
Yeah, they were fun, but the Christian undertones and sometimes overtones got a little annoying after a time.
I wouldn't classify them as fun. I found them too preachy and condescending. It was just, and filled with huge jumps in logical continuity, and to the point where the characters in the books were just ridiculous. You couldn't even classify them as caricatures.
That's Christianity, Tyler. Remember?
Yeah, that's true.
Okay. Well, in any case, that's what a myth is. And that being said,
but back to the original question of a unique monster in D&D, I can think of one.
Okay.
The Mimic.
Oh, the Mimic. That's a good one. Yeah. I mean, and it's actually inspired other. You see mimics in other franchises, and hell, in like Japanese ones too, in JRPGs.
Yep. But D&D is that entire monstrous concept didn't exist until the good folks over at TSR came up with it.
Yes.
I said TSR, not Wizards of the Coast or Hasbro,
yes,
because it was originally the folks when it was just TSR who came up with it.
Yeah. Well, so we see these mythologies in turn spawn more mythologies. There was another. Anything else to add to that, Tyler?
To add to, see here. Oh, there's doubtlessly going to be other monsters that are complete wholesale inventions for the D&D crowd, or from the D&D crowd. But honestly, I can't think of any more off the top of my head.
Yeah. Well, in any case, that kind of what I was wanting to move on to is, the idea of more recent myths and how they could figure into gaming. And I have this book here I'm holding right now called The Book of the Yokai, which is not a complete treatise, but it's a good summary of the role of Japanese monsters, or yokai, or oni. And they mention some older ones here, like the kappa and the kitsune, but there are also a couple of more recent ones. For example, this slit-mouthed woman. It's a legend that I think is only a couple decades old, of a woman, I think in a mask or something, who will come by, sit next to a person on a bench and ask them, "Am I pretty?" And if they say yes, she will take off her mask and reveal that she has basically slit mouths. According to the myth or urban legend, she was received botched plastic surgery, which basically cut her mouth open. And there's only one way to get away from her. You say the Japanese equivalent of so, then she'll walk away. There's also, I think it's Hanako of the Toilet, which is a little older. It's a myth of a girl who is basically crying and a ghost girl trapped in the bathroom. I think there was actually a character like that in Harry Potter. Not sure if that was a direct inspiration from this myth, Hanako of the Toilet, but there you go. So this is kind of one thing you can do in role-playing, is you can draw from more recent mythologies in the creation of new monsters. It doesn't take that much work. This book has several more recent examples of Japanese yokai, and I can see a lot of different ways you can make new monsters for the game. I think that's one thing that game masters and even game writers need to do, is look into more existing mythologies and urban legends, and branch out to underappreciated ones like Indian mythology. You have any idea how many awesome, weird creatures there are in just the story of Ram?
Yeah, like the Rakshasa.
Well, I'm not saying they weren't completely ignored, but I'm just saying it's a much deeper well than people realize.
There's also, concerning modern-day mythology getting into gaming, the myth of the Slender Man from the website Creepypasta.
There we go.
That was turned into a video game recently.
More than one video game, I think. There's also, I think a couple more freeware games too, but the Slender Man which was professionally made, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for somebody to make a variation on it where they give the Slender Man hit points and stuff and allow you to walk around and try and shoot him.
Well, then you have like instances where games themselves engender mythologies, like Ao Oni, I think that was the RPG Maker game about a blue ogre that was made into a live action movie.
I did not know that.
Yeah, it's one of those very heavily Let's Play games where they use the JRPG Maker, RPG Maker, which you wouldn't think be very good for making a horror game, but it actually got some popularity, and now they have, I think, there was a movie made out of it. But again, that's an example of a Japanese yokai, and there's actually a lot of new ones still being invented today.
Mark this date, folks. And finally, a podcast where Tristan brought up something I didn't know about.
I've done that before, Tyler, and you know it.
To continue, see here. If we're going to be going that direction, the direction of video game elements being incorporated into more conventional role-playing games, trying to think of a few.
There aren't that many, but again, video games are a relatively recent medium, but I'm just saying it's just starting to happen now. It takes time for it to kind of seep into the collective unconscious. And yes, I use that term to annoy you, Tyler.
That's true. There's a video game called The Forest or The Island or something like that.
There actually is a video game, both The Forest and The Island. They're both video games.
Well, it's a survival horror video game.
They're both survival horror video games.
If I can finish my freaking topic. Where you're a crash wreck survivor on an island that's filled with some sort of cult that's just like psychotic cannibal people who like stitch people together into like arachnid abominations and things of that nature. Very much inspired by The Hills Have Eyes.
Okay, yeah. I've seen Let's Plays of The Forest. That's what you're thinking of, Tyler. I think it's still an alpha, believe it or not.
Seriously, it's been years since I last saw somebody playing it.
Well, it's still an alpha.
Oy.
It's not a huge team, and it's a pretty ambitious project, so I'm not terribly surprised. But with Steam, all things are possible.
That's true.
So yeah, and then that I did draw that. So that's more borrowing cultural. I'm not sure I'd call that mythological at this point, but the same principle applies here. So. Yeah, there's what else? Other examples. Here, I had a few written down here. I've already used up a lot of them here. I think we may. Oh, go ahead.
I can think of a kind of oddball example. Mm-hmm. After the Mind Wars, the game the setting that we have in house, where you play as a character in essentially a refugee village out in the middle of bumfuck Knotworth invading a stan after the subterranean D&D races invade the surface and both sides essentially wipe each other out, and you're responsible for managing this town and trying to have it survive and thrive. Well, the idea that I had for that came from two sources. First off, it was from the always promised and never delivered war between these psychic subterranean races and the magical surface races. And secondly, it was from a book, 1632, wherein a town from modern-day Virginia, due to a cosmic accident, ends up getting transplanted to this hillbilly dying coal mining town, and ends up getting transported to the middle of the 30 Years' War in Germany, and ends up having to survive and thrive, and yada yada yada. And those were the two inspirations for it. The whole translocating of people to an fantasy world is a modern day trope in a lot of literature.
One of my favorite ones too, I would like to add, yeah. So that would say so. But as we were talking, I actually brought to mind of a major thing, which is definitely now a modern mythology: zombies.
Ah, yes.
Mm-hmm.
The modern day zombie literally did not exist until I think it was Night of the Living Dead was the name of the movie.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the concept of walking corpses is one of those older than dirt tropes, but it was really codified by by Night of the Walking Dead. And of course, like any good myth, there is a deeper meaning and resonance for it. The idea of the mindless consumer, the individual who was dead but still walking. And since then, it's gone on to spawn in every conceivable media we can think of. Games, check. Novels, check. Movies, check. Series, check. You name it.
I have a hard time thinking of any sort of first-person game produced, or any first-person game produced in the last, say, 10 years or so, that either doesn't have a zombie mode, zombie analog, or has a zombie downloadable DLC.
And again, this is a myth, I think, that appeals to the modern listener, reader, or whatever, because it does have such good resonance with today, and even not too long ago too, because again, this idea, it's a ever-present fear. There's an uncomfortable truth or a comfortable meaning behind the zombie state, and that's why it's thrived and gone on so far.
I have to agree with you on that point.
Yeah,
people are just, especially after this past election season, we've gotten a good hard look in the mirror and have been forced to realize a lot of uncomfortable truths. It seems to happen in 4-year cycles, oddly enough, where we look at what we have done to ourselves and we either try and hide from it, or more and more of us wake up and realize, holy shit, we need to change. And one of the things that we've seen that's wrong with ourselves is this growing emphasis on the consumer culture. And it's back in the day they used to call it bread and circuses. Now it's the mall and reality TV.
Mm-hmm. So that's, and again, we incorporate into games because it's another facet of culture and society. And that's why a lot of games, how there are some role-playing games which focus entirely on, one or at least that's a major component. All right, we've kind of gone over a lot of different. One other major one we should mention before go on: vampires, which I knew you were going to bring up. I'm surprised. I should say I'm surprised.
Well, I did mention adopting into D&D a lot of the mythology from Orthodox Christianity, Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And our modern day vampire myth is almost a complete port from the Orthodox religion.
Yeah, but I mean, there's always, notice how there's usually a template, that's which D&D initially borrowed from, and it was, society as a whole, culture did. Bram Stoker's Dracula.
A bit of a misconception, since Bram Stoker borrowed his concept of Dracula from Orthodox mythology. The character even comes from deep in the heart of where the vampire myth in Orthodox Christianity originated, because Eastern Europe is Orthodox.
I know. I'm not saying he didn't borrow
or anything like
I'm not saying he didn't invent them wholesale. I'm just saying that he borrowed from that, but he was a template which everyone then kind of looked at and copy pasted over and over again.
Oh yeah, he was definitely the breakout role for it.
Mm-hmm. And since then, it's actually relatively recently, it's gotten very popular. Like back in the 80s and 90s, that's when the vampire craze really began to explode, due in no small part to first there was Anne Rice. And then came White Wolf Games.
Vampire the Masquerade.
Yes.
I remember those days.
Yes. I steered clear of that myself. It was not my crowd.
I did not.
I know.
I loved just completely screwing with the entire game itself.
I can get behind that cause. Yeah, they took themselves way too seriously, a lot of those people. I mean, they're the ones who realized it was just a game. And I shouldn't say that. Most people knew, 99.9% of people knew it was just a game, but they still took it way too seriously.
And before the character of Deadpool even existed in comic books, I was playing a Malkavian assassin whose insanity was that he realized he was a character in a role-playing game. Yeah, my character thought he was in a modern day D&D game.
Okay, so again, like zombies, there's it works because it is mythology. It has a resonance of the predatory nature, and also the sexual, the forbidden fruit of sexuality, repressed but also tempting. I'm sure many other people have discussed it and explained it better than we have, so I'll just touch upon it and mention it.
Well, actually, something I need to touch on in relation to that and the concept of mythologies is White Wolf Games developed an entirely, deep and extremely rich mythology. But of that mythology, there was actually, or most of it has been, ignored by the wide world of gaming at large. But there's one trope in that mythology that did not exist until White Wolf came up with it that has been adopted wholesale, and that's the concept of some sort of feud or a war between vampires and werewolves. The original vampire myth, one of the ways that you could become a vampire is by being a werewolf who dies. There was no differentiation between vampires and werewolves worth speaking of in the original mythology.
Which is a nice segue to werewolves. I write a lot of werewolf fiction, so I've done a little research on the topic. Again, resonance, wild bestial side coming out. There's also a bit of Jungian psychology there, the idea of the shadow archetype or the repressed wants or needs, and the idea of coming to accept them and recognize them and incorporating them into your psyche is a way to kind of achieve, I wouldn't say enlightenment, but more stable psyche and kind of self-actualization. That's kind of the way I look at it. Of course, it is a reinterpretation of werewolf mythology, which is often simply a cursed individual. Although, funnily enough, there was a tradition, or at least a mythology of werewolves who were actually avengers of God, I think, somewhere in Eastern Europe. Do you remember? You ever heard of that one, Tyler?
Yeah, that wasn't Eastern Europe. That was Russia.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. There's also, in addition to that, there's the wolf belt type of werewolf, which was somebody who had made a belt out of wolf hide. And whenever they put the belt on, they would become a wolf. And that was, if I remember correctly, from the English islands. And the idea, or from the English islands in Germany, and the idea was that during the harsh winters that they would have at the time that the myth arose, it was easier to find food as a wolf than it would be to try and hunt as a man.
To be honest, Tyler, you learned this mostly because you read the Dresden Files books.
Actually, no, I knew about it before that.
Oh, okay. I'm really impressed.
Remember what I said about the deep and rich mythology of White Wolf books? It was in there.
Fair enough. And of course, there's also the idea of the skin changer that they would be werewolves who could change by taking the skin of a wolf. And of course,
actually, that's a North American myth.
Oh, sorry,
and it isn't. Or the skin skin changer wasn't. It was somebody who could assume the characteristics and form of a animal by wearing the skin of that animal, but it wasn't a one-shot thing. It wasn't like I can only become a wolf or I can only become an eagle. It was any animal.
I mean, that was a very common tradition where you would wear these animal totems and become them for sake of sacred rituals, and of course, in myths and legends, they could actually become the creature. But yeah, that's a pretty widespread tradition, not just, I think, in North America, but also throughout the world.
Yeah, but a lot of the reason the tradition exists in England and the Germanies is because of the berserkers, which means the bear shirt warriors of not Norse mythology, but actual Norse reality. It was a bunch of people who would basically lube themselves up with a woad extract and put on a shirt of bear hide, and as the extract seeped into their bloodstream through their skin, it was basically think of it as PCP version 1.0, and they would just go ape shit on people. And people thought, hell, even the warriors thought that they were adopting the strength of the bear.
So do you think the werebear from D&D was drawn from that?
Oh, definitely.
Well, funnily enough, though, the werebears are one of the few good lycanthrope species in the book. So that's, yeah.
Yeah, and I highly doubt that anybody whose village was getting raided by a boatload of berserkers would consider them to be good. But yeah.
Kind of funny how that worked out there, how that myth was changed. And all right, so I think we've been beating monstrous creatures to death as far as their role in mythology, but that's a major application of myth in a lot of gaming is we borrow these foes. But that's not the only thing we borrow. We also borrow treasures from mythology. A magical sword,
yes,
a ring of invisibility. I mean, the One Ring, hell.
The Ring of Invisibility, the Helm of Invisibility, the clockwork constructs,
flying carpet,
the flying carpet. So that's a good one. Flying brooms, which actually made an appearance in my D&D game. It was hilarious.
The origin of the brooms.
Of other things, but
the origin of the flying brooms, Tyler.
Yeah, it's another. Stupid Christianity bullshit.
What do you think it is?
Well, originally it was because people would jump a broom in order to get married. And one of the things that witches were originally accused of was fomenting marital discord for whatever fucking reason. And the way you would get divorced in Northern Europe at the time would be to take the broom that you jumped to declare that you were entering housekeeping and the woman could leave her husband by taking the broom and walking out with it.
I've heard another story of the origin or how it was associated with witches. It's a little squicky though.
Yeah, there's a few of them. There's another one about them getting all doped up and drunked up and running around with brooms around a campfire. There's another one about a legend of witches flying to meet the devil at between midnight and 1 a.m., the witching hour, basically. Although it would be midnight and first bell, the witching hour, by flying through the sky on brooms. There's a few of them.
Yeah. Well, in any case,
ranges from mundane to fantastic.
In any case, these are mythological items that heroes use, and there are a whole host of them. Another one is the genie lamp or the genie ring from Arabian Nights.
Actually, there's one other aspect that we should really touch on, and that's the flip side of the monster coin. You have monsters, and then you have the adventurers that hunt the monsters. And we should really talk about where the adventurer archetypes and classes and things of that stuff come from and how they associate to mythology.
All right. Well, we can talk about early myths, or early inspiration, more modern ones. Do you want to start with early ones or more modern ones?
Let's start with early ones, since we've already touched on the berserkers and the idea of a primitive warrior whose power comes from his ability to just flip his lid and go apeshit for a while before he gets exhausted or even passes out. That's a modern day D&D trope that comes from one of the older legends that D&D borrowed from, and I'm really surprised that during the first and second editions of D&D it didn't make an appearance.
Well, I mean, we go to the oldest myth of them all, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, the great warrior king and his bestial companion.
Yeah. Originally, the idea was in order to be a leader of men, you had to be a fighter. Mm-hmm.
And, of course, the idea of Gilgamesh taming the wild man with civilization and him becoming kind of a berserker or companion warrior. There's another one right there.
Let's see here. The whole idea of the rogue and the clever thief goes all the way back to Jack and the freaking Beanstalk.
Well, that goes to the trickster archetype, which again is older than dirt.
That's true. Let's see here.
Well,
then there's the wielder of magic,
the wise men. Yeah.
I mean, come on, let's face it. If you're going to have an entire class that's essentially Merlin from the Round Table, you might as well just freaking call it Merlin.
Yeah. The funny thing is that in most earlier myths and legends, the wise man or the wizard did not play a prominent role in this. Well, he played a prominent role, but he did not accompany the hero. He did not chuck fireballs as a companion. He offered advice and training, but he did not actually participate in the heroic ventures directly. That changed over time.
Yeah, I know that was an oddity. I admit.
Yeah.
Paladins, once again, back to the whole holy or righteous warrior shtick from Knights of the Round Table.
Well, I mean, the Paladins were actually, I think, a part of Charlemagne's Knights or something. That was the original inspiration. I think that's where the word or the term came from. I'm probably wrong here, though.
I can't remember which comes first, the Tales of Charlemagne or King Arthur and his Knights, because I remember they're both from about the same early Middle English period.
Mm-hmm. I think Charlemagne does predate. I may be wrong there, but well, it's two different regions of Europe, though. But in any case, yeah, the Paladin stereotype definitely came from the heroic knights figure. And then there's the Ranger in D&D lore. That was more or less borrowed from Tolkien. So going to yeah. I mean, there were woodsmen before them, but the Strider, the Ranger, come on.
Yeah, definitely. Let's see here. What else have we got?
Well, of course, there's always the Bard, which kind of gets into the rogue archetype, but also the Bard played a very specific role as the Skald, the teller of tales, kind of plays the same role as the wise men did, as more advisor, although he did figure as kind of a sidekick and so forth with heroes in some stories and legends, I think. The companion to
the modern idea of the holy man that can call down miracle from the gods, just by pulling them out of his ass, essentially, is actually a D&D invention.
Yeah, I was about to say, I really can't, in myths and legends or even any mythology or religion where they have these clerics wander around as companion healing and drawing directly upon God powers. I mean, that's not too common, I think. At least not in a lot of Western mythology I can think of.
No, the closest you get to that kind of thing is some Indian mythology where you would have a holy man who would be, because of his particular discipline or whatever, would be granted an ability that he held for his deity, but that was a singular one ability.
Okay, so now we're moving more and more into the modern era. There's one big influence in D&D mythology we should mention, and that is Farad and the Grey Mouser from Frank Lesbin. What's his name? Frank Lebens. I can never pronounce that name.
Fafford and the Grey Mouser.
Thank you, yeah.
From Frank Lesbin.
Yeah.
Yeah, I read that way back in the day. It's essentially it's a collection of short stories that take place in the Greyhawk universe of D&D.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, they pretty much borrowed, let's face it, they appropriated / stole that for the first campaign setting. And again, this idea of the barbarian warrior and the fighter rogue, basically, those were the first, they are the primordial stew of player characters right there.
Yeah, there's a lot of cross-contamination back in the early days between the novelists who essentially popularized the game and the developers of the game itself.
But again, this gets to the idea of...
Probably because they actually knew each other.
Well, again, this kind of harkens back to one of the oldest myths of all, the companions, the great warrior and his companion. Back to Enkidu and Gilgamesh. Yeah. So you see this resonance goes back and forth. That's what kind of drives it. Okay. What are some examples of more modern myths, more modern mythological heroes? I think I can think of one right off the bat, the survivor in Apocalypse stereotype, the Ash.
Yeah, Ash Williams, the vagabond. I even made an entire class devoted to Ash Williams in the Universal Decay system, the vagabond. Basically, it's somebody who's just gone through hell, come out the other end with most of their sanity intact.
And I think that is reaching mythological status here because you see in a lot of movies, a lot of series, and although there have always been vagabonds and survivors and warriors throughout the ages, this is kind of a unique modern twist because he's someone who has survived the end of a modern, safe, civilized world. And that's kind of a reversion, you might say, which gives him a kind of a unique character.
Yeah. The bumbling idiot, he's not completely unique. He's the bumbling idiot who starts the ball rolling and then has to figure out a way to stop it. That goes back quite a ways. But the way it's portrayed, the rendition of the Ash Williams style horror movie, whatever, survivor character, that is completely unique. Because, originally, it goes all the way back to the Aladdin and the other Scheherazade tales. A lot of the heroes out of those tales where, like, literally, if the hero hadn't have been there, there wouldn't have been a problem.
Well, I mean, that's more, I think, a general characteristic of heroes as a whole. A lot of them. I think the idea of the survivor, the weathered, shotgun-wielding survivor of an apocalypse who is, on the front lines between his companions and the zombies or aliens or zombie aliens. That, the resilient one.
Yeah,
that's
somebody with a boomstick and a 6-pack of one-liners.
Mm-hmm. And another one, which is kind of the same role as the wizard, but has a little bit of a mutated role, the idea of the scientist hero or the tech-savvy hero.
Oh, come on. We all know where that comes. Well, let me put this way. Anybody over the age of 30 automatically knows where that comes from.
Well, I think you got me. I not there because there are actually a couple of them I can think of. That Doc Brown, for example, from Back to the Future. That's one.
Actually, it predates what I'm thinking of. Way predates Doc Brown.
Sherlock Holmes. No, that's not really tech savvy. He was just an intellectual gentleman. Yeah.
Da 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 da.
Doctor Who.
Oh, Doctor Who? Come on, MacGyver, man.
I know it was MacGyver, Tyler. I was fucking with you. That's not exactly a scientist tech type, though. I would say, though. So that's it's more of a hybrid.
But that's pretty much. Yeah. Well, the MacGyver style character, somebody who can basically disarm a bomb with bubble gum and a paperclip. That kind of a character is the kind of character people play.
True. But I was thinking more along the lines of the scientist in the movie who determines how to destroy the monster, that sort of thing, who uses his scientific prowess, knowledge, not just like the wisdom or magic or unknown, but through human understanding and intellectualism wins the day. I mean, and not, tech is a big part of that, but it also is just through science and pure science knowledge. That's why I'm more thinking of. MacGyver definitely has elements of that, but I'm more thinking of the guy in the white coat who determines the monster is weak against acid or something.
Yeah, that's more of a callback to modern mythologies of Godzilla.
Possibly. But I think that still has a prominent role as a more modern myth, yeah.
Oh, and don't forget the psychic characters.
The sidekick or psychic?
Mental
powers, yes. So what makes them different from, say, wizards and so forth?
Originally, what we consider, the psionic characters goes back to, what was the name of it? I can't remember it, but it was a really popular book series about a world that was that was colonized by a failed colony ship in the distant future, where they ended up losing their technology, but there's some weird element in the world or something like that enhances people's mental abilities to the point where they start developing psychic powers. And that's our D&D borrowed wholesale from it.
Was that the one?
Really hardcore.
Was that the one where it has elements of Indian mythology in it?
Yeah, I think it might be.
I think so. Well, in any case, yeah, I think I know what you're talking about there. So that's kind of a far more recent one. I say not as prominent, but definitely there. Although half the time they play the villains, though. To be fair, Tyler.
Yeah, but that book series that I'm talking about, it was already established when I was born. And I'm an old geezer.
All right. So I think at this point we're just kind of listing off all the modern hero types. So we could probably go on, but we're reaching the hour mark. So I think we should start reaching our conclusion to this rambling tale and examination of mythology and games. Anything you want to add?
Trends towards the future.
Trends towards the future. Good. We've kind of, again, touched upon that with the idea of modern myths and how they are starting to be incorporated into games, and how there's actually now crosstalk between games inspiring myths, vice versa and so forth. In the media, we have multiple different forms of media in which perpetuate these myths and how and places them develop, and it's no surprise that games already, which heavily borrow from existing mythologies, are now starting to create their own. It's, I think, a natural trend in considering human psychology and our culture.
Well, if we're going to be discussing mythology and how it influences gaming. And we really are remiss if we don't bring up modern mythology, the myth of the superhero.
The very last one, yeah, I almost forgot about that. They are kind of modern myths, the Superman, the Batman, and so forth. You could argue that they are just kind of reincarnations of existing gods, though. You know, there have been, hell, they more or less directly implied that in a lot of comic book series.
That's true, but there's also the fact that some of the more popular games and some older games that are almost coexistent with D&D. They are superhero based games. It was practically the first thing off the somebody's desk right after D&D became popular was, if I remember correctly, Mutants and Masterminds.
That's one of the older ones, yeah.
But and there's a archetype that's come from this mythology that is kind of like reverse porting into a lot of fantasy games. The archetype of the engineer hero. Not the scientist who figures out what the monster is weak to, but the guy who builds the gun to kill the monster.
That's MacGyver, yes. The engineer and the scientist. There we go.
Yeah, there's a book series that the fourth one is supposed to be out I am so geeking out to see, because the fourth one's supposed to be out this month. It's the D-list supervillain series. And it wasn't published in chronological order because it was one of those where he went back and did a prequel and then he continued the story. But I highly recommend people read it in chronological order. So that would mean that the first book to read would be Origins of a D-list Supervillain. And it is a premium and prime example of the engineer style, the technical style superhero. Or in this case, supervillain.
All right, and that might be a good note to end the podcast on. That's been about an hour, unless you have anything else to add, Tyler.
Nobody paid me for that endorsement.
Okay, I think that concludes the Daemoneye podcast Elf 11 concerning mythology and its appropriation. I don't care if that's a trigger word for anyone in games. I'm Tristan Eifler.
I'm an imaginary friend.
This is J. Tyler Burrell, since he's not, I can't say his name now apparently. And we will catch you on the flip side.